Hi everyone, I'm Jacob Lackner, and it's Thursday, and that means it's time for a history video. As usual, I ran a poll where the viewers decided the topic of this video, and in the end, trial by combat won out. Trial by combat was a legitimate legal proceeding that involved a fight, sometimes to the death, between two combatants in the Middle Ages. Whoever won the duel would help determine the guilt or innocence of an individual. Trial by combat has been a pretty hot topic in 2021, so I think it's a pretty good time to take a look at it. On January 6th, Rudy Giuliani infamously used the term in referring to how Trump supporters should behave in response to the US Congress certifying the 2020 election results, and later this year, a movie called The Last Duel also deals with the subject. This movie, which is directed by Ridley Scott and stars Matt Damon and Adam Driver, deals with a trial by combat that occurred in 14th century France. In addition to those incredibly recent events involving trial by combat, people also tend to be somewhat familiar with the idea from pop culture, largely as a result of Game of Thrones, where Tyrion Lannister relies on trial by combat to bail him out of situations more than once. In this video, I'll discuss the origins of trial by combat and how it worked, and we'll look at a few specific instances of trial by combat to give you a feel for what it was like. So, let's begin with a look at where trial by combat came from. Unlike a lot of medieval legal traditions, trial by combat does not have its basis in Roman law. Instead, it's a distinctly Germanic practice, and one that precedes the conversion of Germanic peoples to Christianity. By Germanic here, we're talking about people primarily in what are today Germany and France, where people spoke Germanic languages. This includes groups like the Franks, Burgundians, and Lombards. These societies valued a man's martial ability over all else. They were polytheistic, and their chief god was a god of war. If a situation arose where it was difficult to determine someone's guilt or innocence, it was believed that single combat between the two opposing parties would determine the outcome. For Germanic people, whoever won the fight was given their superior fighting ability by the god of war, and thus the outcome could, in the minds of many, empirically determine the guilt or innocence of an individual. As is true of many aspects of their culture, when Germanic people converted to Christianity, they didn't simply leave behind their old ways. Instead, they largely repackaged them, and then they became the dominant culture in medieval Europe. This resulted in the creation of holidays like Christmas and Easter, which celebrate events in the life of Christ, but have very pagan elements to them, like the importance of eggs and rabbits for Easter, and the importance of various plants at Christmas time. Like in those examples, people didn't stop believing in the idea that some higher power helps them on the battlefield. They just thought it was now the Trinity instead of a god of war. This is something I discussed a little bit in another video called Why Did Medieval Christians Kill in the Name of Jesus? And in that video, I discussed how a fusion of these two cultures helped generate the idea of a crusade, an armed religious pilgrim to the Holy Land. The story of trial by combat is similar. So that's where trial by combat comes from within medieval society. Let's take a look now at how medieval law regulated and deals with the issue of trial by combat. Trial by combat was legally binding in many parts of medieval Europe, and they were believed to determine someone's innocence or guilt just as effectively as a trial by jury could. This was especially true in the kingdom of the Franks, the Carolingian Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, and England after the Norman conquest. Chronologically, trial by combat was a relatively common occurrence between around 500 CE and 1350 CE. Who took part in these fights could vary significantly. Sometimes it was simply the accuser and the accused, but other times one or both parties chose a champion, someone from within their family or entourage who fought for them. In other cases, these figures could simply be mercenaries who made a living taking part in trial by combat for rich people. This probably sounds familiar to you because the character of Bronn in Game of Thrones makes his debut in the series when he decides to be Tyrion Lannister's champion in exchange for payment. These fights were not always to the death. One combatant or champion could choose to yield, at which point the fight would end, but the results of this outcome were just as binding as in a fight to the death. The party that lost was now considered guilty of whatever they were being accused of. If you were a champion and you chose to yield, you could be punished one way or another. This could include a fine, but there are also instances that involve whipping or even amputation of a limb, so deciding to fight as someone's champion was definitely not a decision to be taken lightly. There were usually terms agreed to before the fight, ground rules of sorts. This could involve both combatants using the exact same arms and armor, or each side could choose their own weapon. Some of these duels were fought on horseback, and many seem to have been fought on foot and in close combat, with both combatants using a sword and a shield. You should also expect to have an audience, as the trial isn't really considered legitimate unless there's an audience there to verify the outcome of the fight. It's important to note that trial by combat wasn't really an option for anyone outside of the upper echelons of society, which in medieval Europe usually meant around 1% of the population. Obviously, if you were just a regular person, you didn't own any of the equipment needed for such a thing, and you didn't have the kind of clout or money that would lead to someone agreeing to be your champion. So, when we talk about trial by combat, we're talking about something that really only impacted a very small segment of society. Additionally, there were a whole lot of limitations on who one could challenge. For one thing, you either had to be an equal or a superior to the person you challenged. This meant, for example, that bastards couldn't challenge anyone who was legitimately born. Alright, now that we've discussed some of the particulars of a trial by combat, let's talk about two specific examples. First, let's take a look at a fictional depiction of trial by combat from the medieval epic poem The Song of Roland. While the duel itself never took place in reality, it does show how these types of fights could go, so let's start with that example. The Song of Roland was written in the late 11th century, and it tells the story of Carolingian Emperor Charlemagne's invasion of Spain, which had occurred about 3 centuries earlier. In particular, the story focuses on the leader of Charlemagne's rearguard, a young noble named Roland, who was one of the greatest warriors in the realm, and someone basically everyone loves. That is, except for Ganelon, who plots with a Muslim ruler to have Charlemagne's rearguard attacked as they are returning to France, and Ganelon is another one of Charlemagne's nobles. Roland and the rest of the rearguard fight valiantly, but they are ultimately overwhelmed and they all die. Then it comes to light that Ganelon had colluded with the enemy in order to bring about the death of Roland, and he's dragged in front of Charlemagne and the other barons, who try to decide what to do with him. At this point in time, as a noble, this was about as close as you could get to a jury of your peers, where the other high-ranking nobles in the kingdom made a judgment against you. Ganelon, in this trial, argues that his actions were simply vengeance against Roland and not necessarily treasonous. At this point, one of the barons, a man named Thierry, steps forward and says the following to Charlemagne and the others. By virtue of my ancestors, I must make this case. Whatever Roland may have done to Ganelon, the act of serving you should have protected him. Ganelon is a traitor in that he betrayed him. He committed perjury against you and wronged you. For this I judge that he be hanged and put to death, and his body should be placed as befits a man who has committed treason. If he now has a kinsman who would give me the lie, with this sword I have girded on, I am willing to uphold my verdict at once. So Thierry's basic argument is that Ganelon committed treason, and even if Roland did something horrible to him, he should have waited until another time to pursue vengeance. Thierry is so certain that Ganelon should be executed for his crime of treason that he puts his own life on the line, inviting any of Ganelon's entourage to fight him in trial by combat. And one of Ganelon's kinsmen does step forward to do battle, a man named Pinabel, and then the two parties prepare for the duel, which is where we'll pick things up now. Now that the battle is arranged, they make confession and are absolved and blessed. They hear Mass and communion and place generous offerings in the churches. God well knows how it will end. Here's where we see the religious aspect of this type of combat. Both men go about their duties as Christians, and they make sure to do confession and absolution before the fight, so that if they die, they will have a quicker path to heaven. And of course, the author notes that God is the one who determines the outcome of such a battle, and some of what Pinabel and Thierry are doing seems almost like they're making offerings to a pagan god of sorts to try to sway the outcome of the fight. The battle is a pretty epic one, with Pinabel the superior fighter, but God somehow saves Thierry from what should have been a mortal blow, and then this happens. Thierry strikes Pinabel on his helmet of burnished steel. He broke it and split it right down to his nose. His brain spilled forth from his head. Thierry raised his sword and flung him dead. With this blow, the combat is won. The Franks shout out, God has performed a miracle. It is right for Ganelon to be hanged. This whole episode really shows you how important these trials by combat are within the noble class in medieval society. Rather than there being some discussion of evidence and things like that, the characters in the Song of Roland put all their faith in the trial by combat to determine what should happen to Ganelon, because ultimately, once the trial by combat has begun, the outcome is in God's hands. So from their perspective, whatever happened in that fight would have been legitimate because God willed it to be that way. And yeah, the outcome is not good for Ganelon. He ultimately ends up being drawn and quartered, and that's the end of him. Let's move to another example, one that we know actually occurred instead of simply appearing in a work of literature. This example dates to around 1100, about the same time as the Song of Roland was written, and it involves a noble named Engelardus and the monks of the monastery of Saint Serge. One thing to keep in mind is that the document was in fact written by the monks of Saint Serge, so there is some degree of bias here. Anyway, the two had landholdings that bordered one another, centered around the Loire River in France, and the entire dispute in this case was a result of a disagreement over where one party's land ended and where the other began. Both claimed control over a couple of mills and fields, and they appealed to Bishop Geoffrey of Mayenne, who came to the site to try to put an end to this dispute. That's where we're picking things up with this primary source, which reads, when Bishop Geoffrey of Mayenne was unable to peacefully bring an end to the quarrel, he determined that trial by combat should be fought under his judgment concerning the matter. The bishop observed the two champions, taking an oath on the sacrament, and decided to fight with shields and staves. And just as is written that God opposes the prideful, he weakened the champion of Angelardus, so that the enemies of the holy martyrs Sergius and Bacchus were utterly terrified, and the champion of Angelardus was defeated. Where these enemies had previously not wanted peace, now they themselves were the ones who suggested it. They offered to the monks as a means of concord the entire tithe of the mills and the fish caught nearby, and they agreed to pay rent for every mill that existed and every mill they would build in the future. So, in this case, we have a bishop recommending trial by combat and monks who agree to take part in it. Again, driving home the point that religion and trial by combat were intertwined in medieval society. Both sides chose a champion, and in this case they used largely non-lethal weapons, as a staff can do some serious damage, but it usually didn't kill anybody. Ultimately, Angelardus' champion lost, and Angelardus agreed to acknowledge what that loss meant. He was in the wrong, and he needed to pay rent for the land, which was rightfully the monastery's, as the trial by combat showed him. Trial by combat continued to be practiced for many centuries, though there were various secular and religious authorities who spoke out against it. By the 13th century, this campaign intensified, but trial by combat as a legitimate legal proceeding continued as late as the 16th century, before finally being outlawed throughout most of Europe. However, in many ways the practice did live on. Duels continued to be fought by men in early modern society, including the founding fathers of the United States, with Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr's duel one of the best known examples. However, where this type of duel differs is that it didn't have any legal power. The kind of duels that people would fight in the post-medieval world were largely about honor and respect, not as evidence of guilt or innocence. Well, that does it for this video. If you enjoyed it, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you want to have a say in what the next video is about, check out the poll on the community tab. Thanks for watching.